Continuing on with the 6 antitheses here. So we've taken some time with these first 2 antitheses. You've heard it said, don't commit murder, but I say, do not be sinfully angry with those who hurt or violate you. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I say, anyone who even looks on someone to lust after them, not to be attracted to them, but that has allowed the temptation to actually lead to a choice. There's got to be a choice here. There's no choice, there's no sin. If it's just a feeling or a thought, we can rebuke that and bless the person. But once we choose not to rebuke, but to accept the thought, once instead of blessing the person, we decide to use the person, now we've stepped into the realm of sinning against that person. In the realm of sex, we call that lust. We've taken some time on those first 2 to sort of unpack how Jesus is both intensifying and internalizing the law. I'm going to move a little more quickly through the next 4, now that we've seen the pattern. Just make a few comments on the final 4 antitheses here that wrap up chapter 5, that first of our 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount. The next one is this. Jesus reminds them that in the Old Testament law, God allowed for a divorce certificate to be given in the case of a man divorcing his wife. Now, a couple things about divorce in the ancient world. One, men could divorce women in this Jewish culture, but women typically couldn't divorce men. Not at that point in history. Secondly, many Jewish men felt that they could divorce their wife for any reason whatsoever. Literally. In fact, there's one rabbi that talks about, he's using examples for what you can divorce your wife for. And he talks about things like, burning your meal. You get a meal that's been burned in the fire too long, you can divorce your wife. I mean, literally for any reason you were dissatisfied, you could divorce your wife. And so we know that divorce through much of the ancient world was common and was male-centered and was not hemmed in any sense, given any parameters around values of love, but was often for the betterment of the man or the man's family, etc., etc. This is the context in which Jesus is speaking now. Now, in the Old Testament, Moses had said this: if you're going to divorce your wife, at least give her a certificate of divorce. I mean, drop the paperwork, make it legal, and give your wife that. Because otherwise, if you divorce your wife but give her no proof you're divorced, it's going to make it all the harder for her to be remarried. And for a woman to be unmarried in that time and place and culture was a very, very difficult state of life. Males in that culture were the primary protectorants of the women. And so households were male-centered. And often economic transactions were male-centered. Women, for example, couldn't be legal witnesses in a court of law. Everything was shifted towards a patriarchal dimension of life. And so in God allowing divorce certificates, he wasn't condoning divorce per se. What he was saying is, if you're going to go ahead and divorce, which is breaking a covenant, at least protect the woman of that culture by giving a divorce certificate so that she can prove to another man that she really is free from the first marriage, possibly making the second marriage more likely and for her to be protected in that. So it wasn't that God was pro for divorce, it was that he wanted to minimize the damage that was being done to women in ancient divorces. So now this is the context in which Jesus speaks this commandment. He says, you've heard it said that Moses, God through Moses, talked about giving a divorce certificate to those who are divorced, to the woman who's divorced. But I say, here's Jesus' intensification in ratcheting up the challenge of this. But I say, that whoever divorces his wife causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. In Jesus' time, there was some debate amongst Jewish teachers as to what's the allowable reasons for divorce. I mentioned one rabbi who said anything, including burning the food. Another, that was a rabbi named Hillel. Another rabbi named Shammai, these are two famous rabbis in the ancient world, he said, no, you can't divorce a woman for any reason, but you can divorce her for sexual sins, so for adultery, things like this. Jesus, instead of getting drug into that debate and taking sides with one of these two men, basically, as Jesus often does, says, wrong question. The question shouldn't be, what does my wife have to do so I can divorce her? Which is a very self-centered question. Jesus' perspective is, look, divorce breaks covenant relationship. And covenant relationship is the purpose of humanity's, that's the context in which we express God's love, which is our calling to be the image of God. So God's people shouldn't be trying to figure out loopholes by which they can destroy relationships. They should be doing everything in their power to maintain relationships. Jesus is pro-relationship, pro-agape love, because he is pro-human relationships imaging God. And so Jesus just calls on the carpet this whole silly debate of the ancient world about what do I have to do to be able to justifiably divorce my wife? Jesus' answer is, you cannot justifiably divorce your wife. Because in either case, guess what? You're pretending you didn't enter that covenant. You're acting as if there was no covenant. But there is a covenant. And the covenant of marriage is supposed to mirror the covenant between God and his people, which God never breaks. So husband, if God never breaks his covenant with you, why are you seeking to break your covenant with your wife? Just really challenging the men of this culture to love their wives as Christ loves the church, unconditionally and permanently. Now we should mention that when Matthew gives this teaching, he says this, if anyone divorces his wife except for the cause of unchastity. So there is what we call this exception clause that Jesus adds in the Gospel of Matthew. What's interesting is when this very same teaching is given in Mark and Luke, there is no exception clause there. It's only found in Matthew. So there's been some debate amongst Bible scholars as to what does that exception really mean? Why is it found in Matthew and not found in Luke and Mark? There's some different theories on that. I'm still personally sort of up in the air on what I think about that, but I think here's what we can at least safely say, is that as this teaching is given to us in Matthew, that because sex is the sign of the marriage covenant, apparently, if that sign is violated through something like adultery or other sexually inappropriate means, it serves to break the covenant. And if a covenant is broken, then of course the parties are free. Now, the parties don't have to act on that broken covenant. You can forgive. You can give covenant mercy. That's a constant teaching of Jesus. But he is saying something, I believe, to the effect that of how serious sex is. Right? We've just seen that in the antithesis before this, that lusting after someone, even just in your thoughts, is serious for Jesus. Here we see that once again, sexual intimacy is a very serious issue for God, not because he's hung up on sex, not at all. This was his idea. He invented the thing. But it's because of what God created it for when it comes to humans. Sex is never just for procreation when it comes to humans. Yes, it is for the rest of the animal world. But with humans, it is also the sign of the marriage covenant. And so I think that's why this turns up in Matthew, is there is something about violating that sign that breaks the marriage. And yet, even in broken marriages, Jesus' other teachings call us to reconciliation, to mercy, to forgiveness, and to repair of that relationship. The next antithesis is about vows, promises. Jesus basically says this: you've heard it said, keep your vows and your promises. Now, Jesus is certainly for keeping our promises. But he goes on to say this: but I say to you, do not swear by heaven, or he gives a number of things that he says, don't swear by these things. Like, I swear to God, that, something, or I swear on a stack of Bibles, or I swear on my mother's grave. Like, those are some of the ways we swear to something in our culture. Jesus is saying, don't do that. But let your yes be yes and your no be no. So he's not saying don't promise to things. He's saying that when you do promise to something, just say, I promise. Don't say, I promise and swear on my mother's grave, or I swear to God that I will. Why not? Here's why. There's always a context to these teachings. Remember our principle. Never just yank a verse out of context and go, okay, do this. We got to ask the question, why would Jesus give this teaching given his social context, and how would that apply in our day? In Jesus' day of age, it turns out that there was and really in any day of age probably, but certainly in Jesus's too, there was a problem with people telling the truth. And so, because we generally don't trust others, we come up with these ways of having people swear to something, like swear on a Bible in a court of law. And that was going on in Jesus' day too. And what Jesus is saying is, look, my people, my community, shouldn't have to swear on something in order to be able to trust them. My people's word of yes should be just as strong as if they swore on a stack of Bibles or on God. Because if you have to swear on the Bible or on God, that must mean that when you're not saying that, you're untrustworthy and could be lying to me. Jesus is trying to once again communicate that his people's integrity and hearts should be trustworthy, so that all they have to say is yes or no, and that's as good as if they were swearing on a stack of Bibles. Because we always tell the truth. We don't find ways of deceiving others unless they force us to swear on something. It's about being truth tellers as opposed to people who cannot be trusted. The final two antitheses are so powerful, and they bring us to the core of Jesus' teachings on radical love and therefore radical nonviolence towards any other human being. Let me read these words. Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 48. I'm just going to read the whole passage here. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, this is known as the principle of lex talionis. It comes right out of the Old Testament multiple times, and it was the very law that was the basis for the whole Old Testament justice system. This is serious business. It basically says this: what someone does against someone, that very same thing is required from them. If someone knocks someone's tooth out, their tooth should be knocked out. If someone gouges someone's eye out, their eye should be knocked out, right? That's right. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If someone kills someone, well, then they deserve the death penalty because their life should be taken too. In other words, it's a quid pro quo, literally show no mercy. In fact, it actually says that in the Old Testament at times. Do not show mercy, rather use the eye for eye principle. Otherwise, the whole system of justice falls apart. Jesus quotes that fundamental Old Testament teaching and turns it on its head here. Listen to what he says. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the person who is evil. Whoever slaps you on the cheek, right cheek, turn to him your other cheek. And if anyone wants to sue you in the court of law, bring a lawsuit against you, and take your shirt, well, don't just give them your shirt, give them your cloak also. And whoever says to you, I want you to walk a mile, don't just go the mile, go 2. Quote, go the extra mile. Now, these are all things that were happening in Jesus' day. To slap someone on the right cheek was a form of insult in the ancient world. It was an act that really shamed the person in public. Jesus saying, when someone insults you or shames you or disrespects you, don't do what the world does, which is try to get back at them, eye for eye. If you shame me, I'll shame you. Rather, no, turn to him the next cheek. In other words, if you insult me, that's okay. If you feel like you need to insult me again, go ahead. Now, notice, only a kingdom person who is rooted in the love of God, who's absolutely certain that their worth is found not in what other people think or say or do, but in what God says is true about them. Notice, that's the person that insults cannot hurt. I mean, yes, they might sting for a minute. No one likes to be publicly shamed. But if your identity is grounded and rooted in God's love and what he says about you, then as the person does something disrespectful or shameful to you, it can hurt for the moment, but only in a relative sense. We have the ability to know in that moment that's simply not true. Their assessment of us does not define us. God alone defines us. And when you are in that place, you can literally turn that back around, and instead of insult for insult, one can give back respect instead of disrespect. One can bless instead of curse. One has the power to stand there and take more insults and be absolutely secure in who one is in Jesus Christ. That security of identity in Christ changes everything for how we deal with conflict with others. That's what Jesus is getting at here. When it says, and if someone wants you to go a mile, don't just go 1, go 2. Of course, it's referring to the law that Roman soldiers could walk up to any civilian and say, carry my armor for a mile. That was the law. Jesus saying, if someone does that to you, that's not fun. It's shameful, but look, that's okay, because your worth is found in me, and you can use what they're doing to shame you to turn around and love and bless them, which just might soften their heart for the kingdom. See, none of these things are because we don't care about our value, because we feel so worthless it doesn't matter if people disrespect us. None of that. This is not done out of a place of self-loathing. This is done out of a place of confidence. Confidence in God's love for us and who he says we are. If I'm secure in that, then someone doing something shameful to me does not change my value in my own eyes or in God's. And that is a place of security to now bless and love this other person. When the Roman soldier forces you in public to shamefully carry his armor for a mile, when it gets to that end of the mile and he expects you to give it back to him, don't stop. Keep on walking another mile. Because guess what? For that whole second mile, this guy's going to be going, what's he doing? He doesn't have to do this now. Here's a beautiful thing about this. When someone attacks us to demean or shame us, by offering love, we actually disempower them from being able to shame us. You take what was meant as shame and you turn it around as love and blessing, and it is a destabilizing reality for them. They literally don't know what to do with this. Love, see, this is the way that Jesus taught us that the world can actually be transformed from the inside out. Love is the one force that can melt people's hearts and begin a radical transformation from the inside outward. We can do all the laws and legislation we want, but no law will ever change a heart. It might manage behavior, but it will not change a heart. Love never has to pass a law. It just has to act in the face of mistreatment, injustice, unrighteousness. It can act there in blessing and service and love, and that is something that humans don't know what to do with. There is no category for what to do with that other than either choosing to harden one's heart against it, and some people will, but it's also that crack in the door to allow the Spirit of God to begin to melt that hard-hearted heart. That's the beauty of this teaching of Jesus. And then Jesus takes it to the final pinnacle here, the last antithesis. You've heard it said, love your enemies. You've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Bless those who mistreat you. And in so doing, I want to start this over. I'm going to pick it up with the last antithesis here. And now we turn to the last antithesis. And here we hit the pinnacle of Jesus' teachings of love and nonviolence. Remember, nonviolence is simply the flip side of love. We as God's people don't act nonviolently just because. It's that nonviolence is an absolutely essential part to agape love in a world of violence. Hear Jesus' words here, because this changes everything for human conflicts. You've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, in order that you may be sons and daughters of your Father in heaven. For God himself causes his sun, right? Sun is a blessing. It warms, gives life. God causes his sun to rise on both the just and the unjust, the good and the evil. In other words, God blesses everybody, including those people who hate him. And since we're children of God who are to image him, we too must bless those, whether they love us or hate us. There are people who treat us as enemies and believe they're our enemies, but from our perspective, we can have no enemies, at least not human enemies. The only enemy we have is a spiritual enemy, the kingdom of darkness and the demonic forces. No human being can be our enemy when we are loving and blessing them. For if you love those only who love you, what reward do you have? Anyone does that. But we are called, Jesus says, to be that unique people who love and bless, pray for, even those who mistreat and abuse us. And Jesus' final words in this chapter are this: therefore, you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Perfection is the calling. Now, Jesus clearly is saying, he's not telling us that we're going to be God, right? I'll never be omnipotent or omniscient. He's not telling me that. What he's saying is, in the way that God is perfectly God, we are called to be perfectly what God designed us to be, humans. And humans were perfectly designed to image God in their characters, their moral characters. I'm not supposed to image God in my knowledge, because I'm not omniscient. I'm not to image God in my power, because I'm not omnipotent. But I am to image God in my love for others, because God's given me the capacity to love. I am to be perfect in my love. I'm not, but that's where I'm headed. If you are in Christ, You are being taken on a journey that will transform you into a perfectly loving being. That's your destiny. And so every day we are called to be on that journey with God, being changed from glory to glory, as Paul says. Little moment to little moment, as I allow God's love in me to pour through me into tough situations where normally a human would attack. Normally a human would exchange insult for insult. Normally, if an eye is taken, I want to take an eye. But I am being called by this teacher, who is Lord, to a different way of life, where when I am cursed, I bless. When someone takes my eye, I'm willing to give more. When someone hates, I love. And Jesus says, this is how you know you're children of your Father in heaven. This is the character quality that is to define the people of God, is we are the people who do not let injustice, insult, disrespect, even murder diminish our love orientation towards others, because we are the children of God who are imaging God even in those difficult situations. With that, chapter 5, the first of our 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount, closes, and we are left with this amazing challenge, one that without the Spirit of God in us is absolutely impossible. It just reminds us once again that if this is our calling, we are radically dependent on God for this to ever happen. Because of my own strength, I will not love when I am abused. I will abuse back. It is only as the Spirit of God is poured into me and I allow, cooperating with the Spirit, that Spirit to pour out to me towards those who are treating me as enemies, that I begin to see they're not my enemy. They're either a child of God or a potential child of God who is not acting appropriately in this moment, but I see the bigger picture. I see the kingdom backdrop there. And I, with the power and love of Jesus, act in ways that I never could on my own. But with the power and the Spirit of God, I remember to rebuke any negative thoughts against them, to bless them as they're cursing me, and to serve them, even as they're demanding from me. Because at some point, my service can go past their demand to the point where they notice they are being loved. And love is the only power that transforms hearts, and therefore this world. Jesus' teachings, if we can get a hold of this church, will radically transform not just us as a community, but how our community brings this missional picture of the kingdom of God to the world.